could be forgiven here for thinking I was working on a Bronze Age collared urn. But actually, it's a beaker. And yet again, it's another massive one. This is the Gravelly Guy, wonderful name, the Gravelly Guy beaker, handled beaker. So I'm busy smoothing out the surface here, but what I'm about to do is to add a handle to it, because it's one of those rare ones that has a handle. And of course that's sort of then interpreted as being a beer mug, I suppose, a drinking vessel, which it might be. It is massive though, it is huge, and it does have quite a chunky rim to it, although the rim has been sloped outwards so that it does sort of tend towards a drinking rim, but it is an interesting vessel. As I say, I'm busy smoothing out the surface here using a piece of horn as a scraper, and just smoothing out the surface. I will then add the handle, and then I'll go on to add in the decoration, which is just single chevron lines. Looks to me like they've been made with a piece of flint, which is quite likely, and that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to use flint to apply that decoration, because it gives a particular sort of little V-shaped groove, a very sharp V-shaped groove. Sharp, it's flint, but it's unlike most other applications of cuts into the surface. So I'm going to just put in a few cuts to make sure that the clay bonds together nicely. Finer point there at the bone point. That's good. Wet that down a little bit. It's slipped up. Yeah, the joining is really important, because this is going to be very low fired. You know, the beakers would have been open fired or fired in very rudimentary kilns. Certainly nothing like we see later, and the temperatures there are relatively low. Usually they seem to be in the region of between sort of 650 and possibly 900 on a good day, but generally speaking I'd say 700 to 800 is the sort of average range that you find on these beakers. That means that the clay is relatively soft. It's not particularly strong, and as such it needs to be fairly robust. Now this beaker's fairly thin. It's not by any means the thinnest beaker I've ever made, but it's a relatively thin walled beaker, and the handle would very easily snap off this body. So what I'm doing is I'm making sure that this handle is going to be well fixed to the wall of the beaker before I start. And the handle does look as if it might well have been pulled, which is, you know, a much later technique. Well, we see it on much later pottery in Britain, Roman and medieval pottery, and it carries on through into studio wares much later. But it's pulling a handle is basically stretching it out by smoothing the clay outwards, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm trying to make sure that what I get is a handle that sort of corresponds to the original. It's not far sprung off the body, it's quite close to the body of the pot, so I'm going to call it there. That's good. And then what I'm going to do is smooth that in nicely, get that well fixed into the body of the pot. I'm going on to the inside to bring it round, and then I'm going to put a reinforcing piece of clay on the inside. I can see it sweeps up nicely inside the handle there. So a thin edge of clay in there, make sure it goes down into the gap there without trapping air. Press that in nice and firmly. There we go. This beaker now starting to look the part of the original. Make sure it's well fixed. I'm not sure that that it would have been entirely safe to pick up this whole beaker if that was actually filled. I suspect there's something like a gallon in there. This is I would go for something like 4.5 litres, a gallon. This is quite a serious vessel, and the weight of that liquid on that handle will be quite substantial. So, is it a drinking vessel? I know there are people who would say they don't think it is. Could it be a grain measure, for instance? Could it be a brewing vessel? I don't know. There we go. It's starting to look the part of what I want there. There we go. Decoration next. I've had a rummage through a pile of flint debitage, care of James Dilly, Ancient Craft, and I found myself a nice little piece that I think corresponds with the sort of length of these cuts. The thing about using flint impressed into the clay is it not only gives you this V-shaped groove into the clay, it also tends to have a little sort of triangular finish to the end of the cut where the flint has fractured. So it is a very sort of particular sort of mark into the clay. And while I haven't got the original beaker here to look at, this drawing does seem to imply that exactly that same tail off to each of the cuts that you get. So what I'm doing with this at the moment is I'm going round and I'm just working round to put in the cut. Now I am using a turntable here to work on, and yes, it's a bit of modern technology that Bronze Age potters wouldn't have had, but as I've shown on several occasions in the past, if you simply put your pot onto a nice grass mat and put that on a little bit of sand on a flat stone, it will rotate quite happily in the way that I'm working here. And I'm quite deliberately not doing the sort of obvious thing of you can spin it round and you can cut grooves which will be absolutely dead accurate, because I want to do it in as close to the original technique as possible. So that's what I'm doing, and as I say, I'm therefore rotating the wheel a little bit at a time, as I would if I had it on sand. And if you're going to ask why I don't have it on sand, it's largely because that makes quite a lot of dust, and over the years my lungs have filled up with enough dust. I don't need any more, thank you very much. So while I do it when I'm doing experiments sometimes, and when I'm demonstrating, I don't do it generally in the workshop. I will use a proper modern type turntable. So we've got that. We've also got chevrons running down the handle. So I'm going to sort of start off by emulating those. And choose a nice bit of this flint that will give me a similar sort of cut, which that looks like it will. And I'm constantly sort of checking back to the original image, which of course again the original potter wouldn't have had to do. The original potter would have just worked straight through, made their pot in their design, nice and simple. With me, I'm having to reference the thing that I'm working on, and now I'm working backwards, largely so as you can see what I'm doing. There we go. Work down the pot. And it is just impress, impress, impress. Okay, Now, with the decoration around the outside of the pot, you can see I've made a couple of cuts already just to check whether this tool was what I wanted. And it does have quite a nice curve to it, which is rather useful. Interestingly, the original pot, I don't know if you can see there, but it's not in a very accurate curve. It's actually more straightened, and I think that's happened during the decoration because a straightish piece of flint has caused the form of the pot to be changed slightly to being straight lines, and I'm expecting that sort of to happen as I work around this one. So I'm starting off with the diagonal chevrons, which start on the top right and go down bottom left and occupy the top third, if you like, of this cavetto zone. There's a good word. The cavity area, because this has a sort of biconical effect, but it's got this what we'd call a cavetto zone in the middle, a cavity. There we go. So I'm going to carry on working like this for some time. And you can come back to me in a while and we'll see how I've got on. There we go, it's well on the way now. And as you see, I've put in the decoration on the shoulder there. I had imagined it would go in chevrons, but it doesn't. It goes chevron and then continues that line down with an extension to extend it down. And in places it has started to push the collar, the cavetto zone, into being a sort of tripartite three planes due to the pressing in of the flint. It's reached a stage now where it's getting really difficult to work underneath there, and looking at this, I'm sure this was flipped over. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take that gently, flip it over, put it upside down on there so that I can work this end. And I'm going to start off by putting the horizontals in. So there are 3 down the bottom there, very definite in 3s. So let's go from the handle area, and I will just work around quite deep ones from the base, it looks like. Although again, I'm working from a drawing here, so always a bit tricky how the original archaeological artist interpreted these things. And then 2 others parallel with those. Well, sort of parallel. As parallel as you get in this sort of pot. There we go, again, just working round. And it does look to me as if this one's probably been decorated fairly wet. Often with beakers, I would wait until they were sort of leather hard or approaching leather hard before I would start to decorate them. But with this one, it does look as if it's been cut into in quite a wet state. So that's what I'm doing. But that does raise up burrs around the edges of each of these cuts. But those can be knocked off later when it dries out somewhat. You can just rub it over with your hand. You get a decent hand burnish on it, and get rid of the bits. And round here, I'm going to go with, what do I fancy on here? There's quite a nice little tool, this piece of flint that I chose. It's got various different depths of cut on it, or sharpnesses of cut. And I'm going to go with that one. And I'm going to go approximately there. I'm not measuring exactly here. I want the spirit of the vessel, not a sort of carbon copy, as it were. There we go. Come on. Two, three. Oh, that's close. Never mind. I'll leave it. Quite often, if I do sort of I will allow that to stay, because you see that in the originals, and I think to go back and try and correct isn't really in the spirit of this type of vessel. So again, these are chevrons. and they are going, I have to make sure they're going in the same direction as the ones at the top. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to go here first and just create, yeah, I'm happy with that. And I will be working around here like this. Now I have to say that this pot is soft enough for me to be actually pushing that in a little bit. And I do, looking at this, it does appear that the chevrons on the actual original vessel in places are not as strong or not as deeply cut as they might be elsewhere. And that could be because it is so soft that it's moving away from the tool a little bit. It certainly doesn't look to me like it's been so hard that it's been resisting the tool. That's the other alternative. But there are quite a lot of really deep cuts in it. So I think when the pot's been supported from the inside, when you're working with the pot the right way up, you can probably get quite a deep cut. Once you're working down here, with the pot pushing away from you a little bit, maybe you can't get quite such a deep cut. Now often I would decorate with one of these pots on my knee, but this one's rather too wet really to do that without damaging the decoration you've already done or distorting the whole vessel. So going round to there and then back again the other direction. Let's go that way. There we go. Do these join? Yeah, they do sort of. I was seeing that the chevrons at the top sort of gap. They didn't quite meet one another. So I've tried to stick with that regime. And now I'm doing the same bit here. Some of them meet, some of them don't. There we go. I don't know if you can see at this stage those little triangular sort of bits at the top where the edge of the flint fracture, the meeting of the different planes in the flint fracture. I'm sure James Dilley would have a word for it. Create this sort of slightly triangular end to the blade, the cut. Now what I can do, even though I am pressing in a little bit here and pushing the wall of the vessel in, is once it's done I can flip it back up and reinstate the form from the inside, and that's certainly what I will do, because I am pushing in a little bit too much in places, I think. But of course the original maker would have had exactly that same option. And last set down here. I quite like working with a piece of flint, it feels right. It's why I always say we try to work with the same tools, the same materials, everything that the original makers would have had, because it would be very easy just to pick up a modern modelling tool and do this, and you would get nothing like the same feel to the mark. So it's very important for us that we make those marks with the right tools, and hence we end up with boxes full of bones and stones and bits of antler, etc. And of course when we do run workshops and we get people to come and make their own toolkits and things, we also get them to make the tools from the original materials. So we do use those materials. Coming round now for the final time, pressing that flint blade into the clay to create those chevrons. And I do think this beaker is now starting to have the look of the original. As it dries, as I will rub over it with my hand, that will take off some of the burrs from the cuts, and it will start to give the surface a light burnish. I don't suspect that this pot was particularly heavily burnished. If it were, you would have lost a lot of this sharp decoration, and also you would have lost the coarseness of the surface. And there we go, job done. So getting really close to the original decoration. It has the right feel to it as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to leave it there upside down so that I don't disturb the decoration by turning it over. But once it's dried a bit, I'll flip it over and we'll have a good look at it. But I think we're on the right track for getting a beaker which has the same feel as that original one.